Welcome to chapter 5. So this chapter is all about the tissue level of organization. Thus far, we've talked about in chapter 2 the molecular and chemical level of organization. Then we moved into the cellular level of organization. We talked about metabolism first, and then the cellular level of organization in chapter 4. And now we're talking about the tissue level of organization. And so when cells come together, they form tissues. The study of tissues is called histology. So if you're interested in learning more about tissues, this is one area that you can go into. A lot of the laboratory technicians, they are histologists by degree. So there are 4 basic types of tissue that we look at. The 4: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So all of the tissues that make up our bodies are composed of at least one of these types of cells. Okay, or one of these, all of the organs, that's what I wanted to say, are made up of these different tissues. And each tissue type is going to have its own basic structure, and then structure determines the function. So we're going to go in order. We'll talk about epithelial tissue, then we'll talk about connective tissue, then muscle tissue, and then nervous tissue. Epithelial tissue is often called covering and lining tissue because it covers surfaces. So it covers all of our organs are covered by epithelial tissue. It covers our entire body. Our integument is covered with, the epidermis layer is epithelial tissue. It lines all of our body cavities. It makes up the lumens of our digestive tract, the lumen of our blood vessels. So it's found all over, and it's in pretty much every single organ. Epithelial tissue is composed of one or more layers of epithelial cells. So epithelium has very little extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix would be material outside of the cells that we'll see is common in other tissue types. Epithelial tissue has no blood vessels, so it has no vascular system, which means you will not have any blood flow to the tissue, which if you've ever got a paper cut and there was no bleeding, the reason there's no bleeding is because there's no blood vessels there. You only went through a few layers of the epithelium, but there's often pain associated with it because we do have nerve endings that can send signals of pain. So epithelium is composed of highly packed cells. And so there is an apical region to the cells. That's the top surface of the cells. Sometimes the apical region has special characteristics, like it might have microvilli or cilia. Microvilli increase surface area for absorption. So we would find cells that have microvilli in areas where we need more absorption. Think about areas like the kidneys, where we're reabsorbing nutrients that we don't want to lose in urine. Digestive tract, where we're absorbing all the nutrients from the food that we ate. And then cells can also have on the apical surface cilia. Cilia doesn't increase. It helps with movement of materials along the surface. So our fallopian tubes have cilia, and the cilia beat the egg towards the uterus. Our trachea and bronchi have cilia, and again, the trachea and the bronchi beat mucus that has trapped potential damaging agents towards our throat where we can spit or swallow. Oh, I'm sorry. I talked about the apical surface, but I didn't talk about the basal surface. The basal surface is the region that attaches to underlying connective tissue. So the underlying connective tissue here is what nourishes the cells. Since epithelium is avascular, it needs to get its nutrients through diffusion, and it gets its nutrients from areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is what makes up the basement membrane of all of our epithelial tissue. So the basement membrane is, the basement membrane, I just said, is composed of areolar connective tissue. It is going to be held with those hemidesmosomes to the connective tissue, and this allows our cells to be protected from potential mechanical pulling away from the underlying tissues, okay? It is highly, I'd say highly, it has innervation. I won't say highly innervated, but it does have innervation. So our epithelium can detect changes, be it pressure changes or pain stimuli, stimuli to let us know that there's materials on us or in us in areas so that we know if our, like an example, if our stomach is distending too much or if our bladder is distending too much, stuff like that. Epithelium is also very regeneratable, which means it's constantly going through mitosis and getting rid of any damaged cells or lost cells, and it's taking place of those. The typical layers that are going to go through mitosis are the ones that are connected to the basement membrane, because those are the ones that are getting nutrients. If you have a multiple layer epithelium, then the upper layers don't get as much nutrients, so they're not going to be able to undergo mitosis. This figure is just showing the same figure that you saw before, but completely labeled now. So what's the function of epithelial tissue? Epithelial tissue typically has two basic functions. It's either, usually it's going to be either for protection. For protection, we're looking at the multiple layer epithelium in general, or it's going to be selectively permeable and allow for molecules to either move in through or move out of the cells. Some of our epithelium secrete materials. So our glandular tissue is composed of mainly epithelium, and it secretes materials. And then we have some epithelial cells that contain nerve endings that can send signals for different functions, pressure, pain, smell, stuff like that. We can classify epithelium either, in two ways. So first, by the number of layers of epithelium. And so the number of layers, you're either going to have a single layer or you're going to have multiple layers. If it's single layered, it's called a simple epithelium. If it's multiple layers, it's called stratified epithelium. And then secondly, what the shape of the apical surface. So the cells at the top layer, what does their shape look like? If it's square, then it would be cuboidal. If it's kind of rectangular, columnar. If it's flat, it's squamous. So here's an example of a simple epithelium. It's single layer of epithelial tissue thick. Very, very good with diffusion of materials, filtration, absorption, secretion. Not very good with protection, does not protect. It's a single layer. So we find a simple epithelium all around the body in areas where we don't have a lot of stressors. So blood vessels along our GI tract, I'll say the majority of our GI tract is simple epithelium. Not all of it, but the majority is. On the air sacs of the lungs, simple epithelium. Then we have stratified epithelium. Stratified epithelium has multiple layers, and you can see there's, you can count the layers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's a lot of layers. I just stopped counting, but you can just count all the way up. The lowest layers, the basal region, down here is what's going to undergo mitosis. And then the cells up here are going to most likely be sloughed off. They're going to come off because of mechanical wear and tear. So we find stratified epithelium in areas where we have a lot of mechanical stresses. So our skin is stratified epithelium. Pharynx is stratified epithelium. Our mouth, stratified epithelium. Our esophagus, or the beginning at least of our esophagus, is stratified epithelium. So the basal layer is the layer that's going to undergo mitosis to replace any cells lost at the top or apical surface. There is another type of epithelium. It's actually a simple epithelium, but it's called pseudo-stratified. Pseudo-stratified epithelium is a simple epithelium that looks like it's stratified. And the reason it looks stratified is because we have multiple layers where we have a nucleus here, nucleus here, nucleus here. So it looks like it's got multiple layers. But every single cell hits that basement membrane. Because all the cells hit the basement membrane, it's a simple epithelium. Not all the cells hit the apical surface, and that's okay. You don't have to have every single cell hitting the apical surface. You just have to have every cell hitting the basement membrane for it to be considered a simple epithelium. The next is by the shape of the cell at the apical surface. Squamous or squamous is flat. It has a flat, irregular shape. When I see squamous cells, depending on if you're looking straight down, as if you're like you have a transverse section and you're looking straight onto an epithelial cell, it looks kind of like a fried egg. Otherwise, if you're looking at it and you have a like a sagittal or coronal section and you're looking at it and it's at top layers, squamous, it looks kind of like a very thin line with a little dark nucleus in the middle of it. Okay. Cuboidal is cube shaped. It looks like a cube, just like this. And the nucleus typically sits in the very middle of the cell. And then we have columnar. Columnar has the nucleus that is typically towards the basal region of the cell. And it's in a column shape, so it's very rectangular, column-like. Transitional is a special epithelium that changes shape. So the apical surface, it's a stratified epithelium. The apical surface changes shape depending on how stretched out the tissue is. So you find transitional epithelium lining the bladder And as the bladder fills, the epithelium stretches. And if it stretches out a lot, then it's going to be more squamous in structure. When it's more relaxed, it's going to be more cuboidal or possibly even columnar in structure at the apical surface. So there's the different tissue types by structure to learn their names. So now let's talk about each of these tissues. So here we're looking at the blue tissues up top. These are simple squamous epithelial cells. When you're looking at a tissue, there are different types of cells that are associated with the tissue. And in this case, this is squamous epithelium. Down here you have some cuboidal epithelium, simple. And then in between we have connective tissue because this is actually an organ of some sort, right? So simple squamous epithelium, the blue cells up here, are super thin epithelium. They have a nucleus in the very center, and the nucleus in the center and the flattened cell is how we identify the cell type. The major function of simple squamous is for diffusion of nutrients across cell surface. We find these in our blood vessels. Capillaries are composed of simple squamous. In our lungs, our alveoli are composed of simple squamous epithelium as well. Simple cuboidal epithelium. So again, you see the cuboidal cells here, you see simple cuboidal cells here, and we see this other tissue here, and then some more cuboidal cells, or I think they're cuboidal. This is, I believe, some type of an exocrine gland. Okay, this is glandular tissue. So simple cuboidal epithelium is typically found in glands or ducts. So exocrine glands, some endocrine glands as well. So exocrine, endocrine glands. And its major function is secretion of materials. So it oftentimes will secrete materials or it will absorb materials, depending on where it's located. If it's a gland, then it's going to secrete something. If it's found like in the kidneys or then it might be absorbing something through its surface, okay? Simple columnar epithelium, you can have ciliated or non-ciliated. Here's simple columnar epithelium. You see these large structures like there and there. Those are called goblet cells. Goblet cells produce a mucin, and mucin, when mixed with water, produces mucus. And mucus is important in trapping a lot of potential damaging agents. So simple columnar epithelium, if it's non-ciliated, it can contain microvilli. It doesn't always contain microvilli. We'll find microvilli in our small intestines, in the simple columnar of our small intestines. Microvilli increase surface area for absorption. In our stomach, then we find non-ciliated simple columnar that is not, that does not have microvilli on it. And its function is for secretion of materials. So it secretes mucus, it secretes other chemicals like hydrochloric acid or pepsinogens, enzymes. So it can secrete different things depending on where it's located. Ciliated then are going to have cilia at the apical surface, and we'll find these in our bronchi, in our uterine tubes, and their job is to move materials towards some lumen, towards some opening. So there's your different simple epithelium. You can go through this on your own. Pseudo-stratified epithelium. It looks like it has multiple layers, but every single cell hits the basement membrane. Not every single cell reaches the apical surface. With pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, we have these goblet cells again, so you can see them here again. They can be ciliated or non-ciliated, so you can see that here as well. Okay, ciliated are going to be found in regions of the body where we need to move materials away from some organ. So in this case, we find ciliated, pseudo-stratified columnar in our respiratory passageways, in the bronchioles, moving materials away from our lungs so that we don't trap or get pathogens in our lungs or dust or anything that could be potentially damaging. Non-ciliated are not as common, and so we do see them in the urethra of the male and in the epididymis. So here you can see ciliated and non-ciliated epithelium. Stratified squamous epithelium then is the first stratified epithelium that we talk about. Stratified squamous can be either keratinized or non-keratinized. Keratin is a protein that protects us from water loss, and all of our epithelial cells of our skin, of our epidermis, are composed of keratinized epithelium. And keratin, as it moves towards the surface, the cells die. So in non-keratinized, the surface cells don't always die. So non-keratinized, this is non-keratinized. The apical surface, the cells still have a nuclei. You can see the nuclei throughout these. These are living cells all the way from the basal layer down here all the way to the apical surface. At the apical surface, they're flattened, so they get that squamous name. We see this in areas where we have a mucous membrane. So our oral cavity, our pharynx, our vaginal canal, the anus, has stratified squamous epithelium that is non-keratinized. Functions to protect the area. It's very protective against mechanical damage. And anywhere that's non-keratinized, it's going to be, we're going to have moist secretions, keeping the tissue moist so that all the cells can get nutrients. Keratinized stratified squamous, the cells at the apical surface are dead. There are no nuclei. It's hard to see. The color is really purple, so seeing the nuclei down here is harder to see. The basal layer have nuclei, but as we move up, the cells will start to die. So once we get up into the granulosum layer, the cells will be dead, and they'll just basically be keratin-filled cells. These are going to be this is found on our epidermis. So it's one area that we have keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, epidermis, and its function is for protection against mechanical damage. Stratified cuboidal epithelium. These are going to be found in our exocrine glands. The function of stratified cuboidal epithelium is for protection, to strengthen the gland. Most stratified cells are not going to have any secretory functions. So typically you'll see stratified cuboidal, and then you'll have like some simple cuboidal around the lumen of the cell itself. If it is so I should say around the lumen if it is a glandular tissue, okay? Stratified columnar epithelium has more than one layer of columnar cells, and again, functions mainly in protection, but sometimes has some secretory functions as well. So rare epithelium as well. Then we have transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium functions in stretching. So where I said in general protection is what we find for our stratified epithelium. Transitional epithelium does not protect. It has a function of stretching. So as the bladder distends, as it fills, the cells stretch out, and that causes the apical surface to change in shape. And that's why it's called transitional, because it changes in shape all the time. So overview, or kind of just to remind you, simple epithelium mainly function in diffusion, absorption, and secretion. They're not protective. Whereas stratified function mainly in protection, except for transitional, which functions in distension or stretching. There's your stratified epithelium. I'm going to stop this video, I think, and then we'll start on the next video with our glands, okay?